All right, today I'm going to be going over some sample solutions for quiz one. So the first one was stirs to floats, which was hopefully pretty straightforward. So the idea was that given some list of strings, so something like this, you would give this to your function and it would spit back out the following list of floats. So let's take a look at some code that we can write to do this. So I already have the signature set up. So we are given some length of strings called stirs, and we want to return a list of floats. So let's just set this up right away. So our result list is going to be a list of floats. It starts out as empty, and we want to loop over every item in our strings list and add each item converted to a float using the built-in float function. Add that to our floats list and then return it. And that is actually it, which is fun. And just to show how this works in the REPL, so if we did stirs to floats of 1, 2, we get back the list 1, 2 with floats instead of strings. The next function was called lookup. So the idea with lookup is that you'd be given one list of strings that represented columns or labels of some kind. So let's just say labels, and let's just, I don't know, height and width, just as a little example. So that was the first parameter. The second parameter is a list of floats called values. So let's just give these, let's just as an example, give some random values. I don't know, 2 and 7. All right, and the last parameter is some label. All right, and so the idea of this function is given some label, look up the value at that corresponding label. So let's just say our label was height in this case. We would want the result of our function, if our lookup function was called with these 3 parameters, we would want the result to be 2, because we're looking up the value in the corresponding position as the label that was passed in. And if we passed in width, we would expect this function to return 7. All right, so let's look at some code for this. All right. All right, so I'm just going to rename. So you can think of the strings as labels or columns, but I'm just going to rename this to be, just kidding, I'm going to rename it to be column because that will make sense for one of the later functions that we write. Okay, so basically what we want to do is we want to loop over all of our columns, and we want to keep track of the index that we're at as we go. So that's why we need this counter variable I. And if the column that we're currently at is equal to the single column parameter that was given to us, or single column argument, that means we found the column we're searching for. And so we want to return the value at this position. So if we were using the same example from before, we would be saying, if our current column is height, return 2, or return the value in that same position that is aligned with our column name. All right, and that's all there is to this one. But in the write-up, there was also instructions about raising a value error if the column was not found in the list of columns. And so we can actually handle that down here. not found in list, because our for loop goes over all of the columns in our columns list, and returns from within it. So by the time we get down to line 23, that means we were not able to find our target column. So we can just go ahead and raise that value error. So if we want to take a look at what this looks like in the REPL, so let's just say columns is equal to high. What am I doing? Columns is height, width, values can be 2 and 7. And so if we call lookup with our columns and our values and we say height, it should give us 2, because 2 is in the same position as the height column. But if we say width instead, we get 7. All right. All right, so our next function is undelimit. So the idea with undelimit is we're given some string with a bunch of characters and maybe some commas thrown in there. And so the idea is to separate the string into chunks defined by where the commas are. So we want to, basically the idea is we're going to search through the string until we find a comma, and this is our first chunk. Then we skip the comma, keep searching till we find another comma, this is our second chunk. And then our third chunk is just the rest of the string. So the result of calling undelimit with a string like this would be this list. All right, so let's look at some code that we can write to do this. We know that our result of this function is going to be some list of strings that is just this phrase string that we're given, separated up into chunks. So we know that we're going to be looking at chunks of our string one by one and adding them to our list. So I'm just going to actually write the example we had before, just so we have it. So if we had hi, hello, bye again. So our first chunk is hi, second is hello, and third is bye. Cool. So what we want to do is we want to loop over every character in the phrase that we're given. And if the current character that we're looking at is not a comma, and let's think about this as like we're building up this first chunk high, right? So we're starting off the chunk as the empty string, and we want to add on the H and the I. So if it's not a comma, we add that character onto our current chunk. All right, so if I'm just thinking about this with our example, so current chunk starts out as the empty string, and then it gets this H, and then it gets this I, so our current chunk becomes high. But then we hit a comma. So this if statement is not true. Our current character is a comma. So down here we have a comma. So otherwise, we know we're done with our chunk. So we can just say we want to append this chunk to our list. and reset the chunk to be nothing. So this is basically saying add hi onto our list. We've processed that little piece, and now we can move on to the next one. So if we wanted to keep track of this in our example, current chunk is now reset. And if we wanted to keep track of our result, separated is currently looking like this. All right, so now we keep looping through our phrase, and now we're looking at this H, so current chunk becomes H, E, L, other L, O, and then we hit this comma, we jump down to the else statement, and we append the current chunk we are building up onto our separated list. So now we have hi, hello. All right, and so then again, like on line 39, our current chunk gets set back to nothing, and we start building up the last chunk, which is B, Y, and then E. And then we hit the end of our loop, we get this E, I is no longer in the range of 0 to the length of our phrase, so we exit the loop. So we need to have, but we still haven't added by to our separated list. So we need to have a case down here outside of our loop where we make sure to add that last chunk to our list and then return it. So I'll just make a note here, append last chunk. So after adding that little piece to our code, now at the end, we should end up with hi, hello, bye. And one last thing a few of you were asking about during the quiz was an edge case. That's always great to be thinking about. So if the phrase that we passed in as a parameter was the empty string, we would just want to return the empty list. And that makes sense, because if we're undelimiting nothing, that means we ended up with no chunks. So, all right, so let me just clear that, and let's try it out in the REPL. Okay. All right, so if we did, let's just do the exact same example. So if we said hi, hello, bye, what do you know? We get hi, hello, bye in a list. All right, so the last function was average column. This was definitely a tricky one. And as you all probably realized by now, this quiz was kind of hinting at the next unit we were about to go into with dictionaries, CSV reading, data processing. And this was just kind of a makeshift way of doing it ourselves before we actually learned those concepts. So let's just look at what this average column function is trying to get us to do at a conceptual level. So when we've been working with data the past week, we want to somehow have the list of our column names. So how do we get that from this? So we can say, these are our columns, right? So our columns are high, low, and precipitation. But right now we just have this as one massive string with commas in it. So how do we go about getting our individual columns? Well, we have a function for that. We can call undelimit to get our 3 columns. Awesome. So let's just say that we had called average column with our data and high. So we want to find the average high in this case. So what we want to do is get all of our numerical values in the first row of our table. So right now, this is just one big string. So the first thing we can do is undelimit, and that will give us a list that looks like this: 81, 53, and 0.01, still strings. But we want these to be actual float values, so we can call stirs to float. And now we suddenly have actual data. We have these 3 float values in a list. So these are our values. Great. So far we have columns, values, and another word that we've used for columns has also been labels. So we have columns, / labels, and values. So thinking back to another function we recently implemented, if our end goal, right, is to get the average of all of the data in the high column, we want to somehow, in the first iteration, we want to extract this 81. So how do we get this 81? Well, we want to look up from our columns and values the corresponding value at high. So just to recap what's going on here. So in each our columns and labels are constant, right? That doesn't change and doesn't require a loop or anything. But we are going to be looping over each row in the data table. And so for the first row, our values are here. And so then we look up, this call to lookup will give us 81. But then the second time, now we're going to be looking at this second row in the data table. Our values, we want them to be 77, 54, and 0.1. And then this call to lookup will give us 77. Right, so this is kind of a mess and a little confusing probably. So let's just go ahead and write some code. Right, so we already got the function signature. So I'm basically just gonna try to translate what I drew out on the whiteboard directly into some code. So first we want to get our columns, which we can just undelimit the first row in our data table, because we're told that the first row is always going to be those columns. And so that's at the 0th index. All right, so if we're trying to find the average, we know the average is the sum divided by the number of elements, right? So let's just give ourselves a little starting point. So our sum starts at 0. So now we want to loop over all of the data in our table. And notice I'm starting at 1 and not 0, because the 0th row in our table was our column names, but from 1 to the end is all of our actual numerical data. So first thing we want to do is get our values. And so the values of our row can be extracted by first separating the strings into their individual chunks and then converting those strings to floating point values. So at this point, our values variable here should be a list of floats. And now we want to look up the value in our data table at the corresponding column that was passed in as a parameter. So we look this up by sending in the columns and our values and the given column that we're searching for. So like I showed on the whiteboard before, if this function was called with high as the parameter, this lookup call will return the floating point value that was in the high column of this row. So we know this call to lookup returns some floating point value, and so we just add this on to our total. All right, And then we want to return the average, right? So we can just return, okay, our variable is also called sum, my bad. Return sum divided by the length of our data. And this was what a lot of you probably did at first to get the average, but remember the first row of our data was not actually data, it was the column name. So we actually want to do the length of our data minus 1 because we have one less row than the length. All right, so that was all there was to it here. If we want to just run through an example really quickly. So like, I'm gonna make a fake little table. So let's just say data, high, low, 1. I know this doesn't really make sense, but it's fine. Okay, so this is our data. Okay, so on line 54, columns is the result of undelimiting the 0th row of our data. So our 0th row is here. So columns is just high, low. Beautiful. Okay. And then on line 55, we set up our sum to start out at 0. And then we start our for loop with I starting out at 1. And the first thing we do is undelimit our data at row 1. So this gives us a list 1. Oops, my bad. 1, 2. And then we convert that to floats. So we have 1, 2. And this is what we store in our values. All right. And now we call lookup with our columns up here and our values down here. And the column we're searching for, I guess I did not specify, but let's say that our function call looked like this. So average column, data, low. Okay, so what we're looking for then is the variable or the value in our values list that matches up with the low column. So that would be 2, right? These are in the same position. And that's what our lookup function would return to us. So we add this 2 onto our sum. Awesome. All right. And then our loop goes around again. I becomes 2. We're now looking at the second row in our data table. So now our values become the string 4 and 5, and then float 4 and 5. And so then when we call lookup, we add on 5 to our sum to get 7. All right. And so then this last line, 61, it's just 7 over 2, and we should get 3.5, which makes sense because the average of 2 and 5 is 3.5. All right, so let me just clear all that, and if we just want to try this out in the REPL, so I'm actually going to copy the exact list from the write-up. So dang it, I thought I could do that easily. Just kidding. Okay, so we'll just say data is equal to high, low, 1, 2, and then was it 4, 5? Yeah, I think that's what I had before. Okay. So then if we do average column, data, low, yay, we get 3.5. All right, well, I hope this helped a bit.